Welcome to the second part of the three-part non-invasive ventilation update lesson. This video will focus on the highlights of the changes to the oxygen policy as it relates to non-invasive ventilation, as well as review the NIV-ST mode and how to calculate transport time thresholds related to oxygen consumption using the O2 tank time application. As you watch this video, during the NIV-ST mode review, you will need to be able to access the O2 tank time application. If available, it may also be helpful to have the Hamilton T1 ventilator nearby to follow along, accessing the screens and settings along with the video. Let's get started. Recent changes to the oxygen clinical operations policy related to non-invasive ventilation are largely related to patient safety and oxygen consumption. Highlights of the changes include transport duration and oxygen requirements in both the BK-117 and the AW-139, when to consult the transport physician and what to discuss with the physician, and when an oxygen consumption calculation is required using the O2 tank time application. If you'd like to review the oxygen clinical operations policy, you will find the draft document attached to the Moodle lesson. In the BK-117 rotary environment, non-invasive ventilation during transport, including specialty teams, should only be considered on missions with transport durations of 45 minutes or less. Oxygen tanks must be full due to high oxygen consumption requirements. In the BK, a full oxygen tank is considered greater than 1200 psi, however, 1800 psi is preferred. It is also required that the mask leak be less than 10% at all times during the transport. In the AW-139 rotary environment, non-invasive ventilation during transport, including specialty teams, should only be considered on missions with transport durations of 75 minutes or less. Oxygen tanks must be full due to high oxygen consumption requirements. In the AW, tank A must be filled if below 1200 psi, preferably if it's below 1850 psi, unless a mission is pending. A back-to-back mission can be accepted without refilling the main system if 500 psi remains in tank A and tank B is full. It is also required that the mask leak be less than 10% at all times during transport. The transport physician must be consulted on all missions in which non-invasive ventilation is being performed or considered. Consultations with the transport physician should include discussions regarding oxygen consumption. Ideally, the air medical crew and transport physician will perform the oxygen consumption calculation together to determine oxygen demands and transport time limitations, ensuring appropriate transport decisions. The transport physician will also be consulted if non-invasive ventilation is being considered, if even for a brief duration, such as a bridge to a more definitive means of mechanical ventilation, or if it is to be used in any other conditions other than CHF or COPD. Transport time thresholds related to oxygen consumption can be calculated using the O2 tank time app found on the AMC phone. This calculation should be performed at 3 points during the mission. First, during the mission planning stage. Second, once the NIV is in place prior to disconnecting the patient from a wall oxygen source. And lastly, at any time AMC make adjustments to the settings, particularly if the patient's demands increase during the mission. It is also prudent to mention that because the Hamilton T1 is able to compensate for leak, mask seal and leak should be reassessed frequently. Mask leak must remain less than 10% at all times during the mission. During the mission planning stage, using the O2 tank time app to estimate transport duration thresholds based on projected oxygen consumption is a bit different than the other stages of the mission. In the O2 device field, you will select T1 Vent EST, then ensure the larger patient field is highlighted. In the flow rate field, you will use information gained in the initial telephone consult in regards to the patient's expected or projected respiratory rate and tidal volume to estimate this value. And that sums up the highlights of the changes to the oxygen policy as they relate to non-invasive ventilation. The main points being the transport time thresholds in the BK-117 and AW-139, when to consult the transport physician, and when to perform oxygen consumption calculations with the O2 tank time app. This segment of the video will review NIV-ST mode on the Hamilton T1. It will also clarify the initial settings and how to navigate the screens, review oxygen consumption, and also review titration of the settings as they relate to non-invasive ventilation. Once you have selected the appropriate size mask, your ventilator is calibrated and the circuit is in place, and you have inputted the correct sex and height of your patient, you are ready to set your ventilator up for non-invasive ventilation. To access the NIV-ST mode settings, use the Controls button located in the bottom right-hand side of your screen above the alarm screen. Note the default settings for NIV-ST, a rate of 12 breaths per minute, an inspiratory pressure of 8 centimeters of water pressure, an I time of 1 second, a PEEP setting of 5 centimeters of water pressure, the flow trigger at 5 liters per minute, and FiO2 of 100%. In this screen, you will need to adjust the rate to 5 breaths per minute, the lowest accepted rate. All other default settings, including those in the More screen, are to be accepted. You can close the settings screen by selecting the X at the bottom left of the screen and begin non-invasive ventilation by choosing Start Ventilation. In our clinical setting, it is not typical for non-invasive ventilation to be performed in cases that are time dependent. In this scenario, let's pretend that our patient is settled on non-invasive ventilation after a certain period of time has elapsed, and we will discuss setting titration and oxygen consumption. Inspiratory pressure, PEEP, and FiO2 will be the 3 most common settings titrated in non-invasive ventilation. There also may be times where you will adjust the flow trigger, but that will be discussed more in depth in upcoming ventilator courses. Inspiratory pressure may be titrated up in 1 centimeter of water pressure increments until the patient's respiratory effort is reduced. Note that pressures more than 15 centimeters of water pressure will rarely be tolerated. Increase PEEP in 1 centimeter of water pressure increments if oxygenation is inadequate. Also note that pressures greater than 10 centimeters of water pressure will rarely be tolerated. It is important to note that the total inspiratory pressures, that is, the sum of the inspiratory pressure and the PEEP, of greater than 25 centimeters of water pressure lead to passive esophageal opening and should be avoided. Once you've titrated the settings and the patient condition improves, if appropriate, you can decrease the FiO2 by 10% every 5 minutes to achieve an SpO2 of 94% or greater. Now that we've discussed titration of settings, let's discuss oxygen consumption. For this patient, let's pretend we are in the AW 139 and have 2,000 pounds of oxygen in the A tank. If we use the value of 6.8 liters per minute, you will see that we have 468 minutes for this transport. Let's practice with the O2 tank time app one more time. You are now in flight and have found the patient to be stable and settled after titrating the FiO2 down to 40%. Please pause the video and use the O2 tank time app to calculate how much time you have to transport the patient using the new settings. You will have 2,000 pounds if you are working in the AW and 1,800 pounds if you are working in the BK. Go ahead and calculate the oxygen consumption. As you can see, using 4.5 liters per minute gives you 707 minutes in the AW and 419 minutes in the BK. And that concludes our NIV lesson. In summary, the highlights of the changes to the non-invasive ventilation policy are a 45-minute or less transport time in the BK, a 75-minute or less transport time in the AW. The transport physician must be consulted on all non-invasive ventilation missions. Oxygen consumption must also be calculated regularly to ensure safe transport time thresholds. In NIV-ST mode, you will have to adjust the respiratory rate to 5 breaths per minute and can accept all other default settings. The 3 settings that are most likely to be titrated will be decreasing the FiO2, increasing the PEEP, and increasing the inspiratory pressure. Oxygen consumption should be calculated at least 3 points during the mission. First, during the mission planning stage. Second, once the patient is stable and settled prior to discontinuing from the wall oxygen source for transport. And lastly, after titrating settings, particularly increasing settings. To complete the NIV update lesson, please print off and complete the NIV case worksheet. Once complete, please hand it in to your local clinical educator. Thank you.